Hi, this is Steve. Welcome back to the American Garage. Let's take a minute and talk about air ride suspension. Now, as I did research to see what these suspensions are all about, I discovered the problem is usually in one of three different places. First, the strut tends to develop a leak and go bad. Second, the pump itself can't pump up enough air and needs replacing or rebuilding. And three, the relay, which turns the pump on and off, burns out. When an air ride suspension develops a leak, it's usually in the air spring itself. It looks like a strut. It doesn't have any springs around it, but it's got this big dust cover on it. But it will develop leaks. Inside there, there's a big rubber bladder that expands and contracts and controls the ride of the car. Now, what'll typically happen is that boot will develop cracks over time and go bad. Typically, you'll see this between 100 and 120,000 miles on an average automobile that has this sort of suspension. This car has about 124,000 miles on it, so we're about due. Now, once a strut develops a leak, you will notice it because in the morning when you come out, that particular corner of the car will be lower than the rest. Or you'll come out and find in the morning that either the front or the back of the car is sitting on the ground or close to it, and the car is too low. Now, you put your key in the ignition, the system goes to work, it pumps back up. What's happening is the pump is then going to replenish the air that is needed to bring the car back level. Now, if the leak is slow enough, that can happen. However, if that does happen, the pump will be working too much. And if the pump is working too much, the pump will eventually fail. Sometimes you'll have a sensor that will sense that it's getting too hot and will turn it off, or it will work too long and it will fail. Now, if that happens, more than likely the relay that turns the pump on and off will burn out as well because the pump is working too long. So the relay burns out, the pump stops working. So it could be any of those three, but if you have a leak, it may be all three things that need to be done. So in this episode, we're going to cover how to replace the relay, how to rebuild the pump, and how to replace the struts. Okay, so let's identify where our components are. First, the pump is located underneath the left side fender on the Audi A8. So we took the liner out, got the car off the ground, took the wheels off so we could get at all the components. Next, we have the air struts themselves. Now, what I noticed on this car was that the front was lower than the back and the right side was lower than the left side, so it was leaning to the front right. So we know we have a leak in there. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to replace both the front struts. Now, it could be that only the one on the right is bad. However, after doing extensive research, I've learned that if the first one on the front is going to go, then the second one is going to go shortly behind it. So you might as well do them both at the same time and save burning out the pump. We're also going to take our pump out and use a rebuild kit to put it back together and make sure that it pumps as much as it needs to for the system so it doesn't overwork itself. Next, we're going to take the relay out of the car and put a new one in. I'll show you where that is. Now, the third component that we're going to be replacing is going to be the relay. And the relay is very simply a little box that's in a fuse panel behind this panel of the dash. Unfortunately, we will have to take this part of the dash out of the car in order to get at the the fuse and the relay. There's a fuse for the system as well. Now let's talk about replacing the parts in an air spring suspension. Number one, if you take it to a mechanic, you're going to find that you can spend upwards of $3,000 to $5,000 to have this work done. So it really is good for us if we can do it ourselves and save quite a bit of money on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace the air springs. Now the air springs themselves, you have three options available to you. One is you can buy brand new air spring units. These tend to be a little bit on the expensive side, anywhere from $1,200 to $2,000 each. Also, you can have your air springs rebuilt or buy some rebuilt ones. And this tends to be a more economical approach, and it has every bit of good quality as the originals. And option three, you can get a rebuild kit for them, although the rebuild kits are not easy to find. And typically all the rebuild kit is the top portion of the air spring, and you just reuse your bottom portion. But with the labor involved and the things that you have to do to put those two pieces together, it's not really that much of a savings over having your air springs rebuilt or buying a set of rebuilt ones. So we're going to go with that option. I found a company that would rebuild our air springs for $350 each. Now, if you were to go buy a brand new compressor pump for the air spring suspension, it would cost around $1,200. You may find some models that are a little cheaper, but it will only cost us about $50 to rebuild this unit. So we're obviously going to rebuild the unit. The first thing we're going to do in this process is we're going to remove the compressor pump. Now the compressor pump is held into place by 3 bolts. We're going to take those 3 bolts loose. We're going to unplug the hoses and the wires, and it should come right out. Let's get the air springs out. Remove all the electrical connectors. Out come the top bolts. Don't mistake these for these. These hold the brace. We have 3 upper bolts that we can access through the engine compartment. 1. And the last one's back here. Next, we'll take loose the control arms on the top. We are ready to proceed with taking the air spring out of the car. But let me just update you on what we've done so far. We had to take the upper control arms loose in order to get the air spring out. Now, here's something that I'd like to point out. This upper control arms are attached to the main suspension unit with this pinch bolt right here. Now this pinch bolt is steel, and the control arms and the suspension components are aluminum. So since we have steel going through aluminum, there's a potential for corrosion because of dissimilar metals. So this often gets stuck. So pack your patience and be very careful with it, and you can get it out. Use your breaker bars, use some soaking, some penetrating oil. I've got some some penetrating oil, and you'll get it out. Just be real careful. Now, if it's super corroded, you may have to drill it out and other things like that. I was lucky on this one. One of the other things that I did discover is that the ball joints that go in the top of here get stuck as well. And those were giving me a lot of grief. Now, let me see if I can save you some grief. Go and get yourself one of these tools. This is for separating the ball joints from the suspension. If you don't have one of these, you can go borrow one from one of your auto parts supply places that also loans tools out. So, you know, don't try to do it without one of these, because you will beat that thing to death with a hammer and you won't get anywhere at all. Trust me on this. I've tried it. Okay, so now I've got all that loose. I'm ready to take the air spring out. I just forgot one thing that I need to do. I need to take loose the air hose that attaches to the air spring. So I'm going to get my 10mm wrench. I'm going to get that off real quick. Alright, all the connections have been removed, the air hose has been disconnected. Now let's remove the air spring from the car. And out comes the old unit, so we can see it. Now we've got a brand new one of these, or a rebuilt one, which will go in its place, but we'll have to take the top off of here. And we lift this off. This unit is ready to be shipped back to be rebuilt for someone else. I'm going to look a little more closely at my control arms. I'm not so sure I'm liking my bushings. I may go ahead and replace them anyway. We did mess up the boots trying to get the control arms out of the fitting. It was very difficult. As you can see, this is what can happen if you don't have that tool. Okay, so first I tried it the old-fashioned way, and this is what happened. So here is our new air spring. So we're going to get this ready to put in the car. First, we will put the control arm mount back on the top. Get the new nuts and bolts off. Let's take this loose. And put the nuts on the top of the air spring, holding the unit together. And I've got it set in place. Got my new control arms, as you probably saw. So now all I've got to do is bolt it up into place and we're ready for the other side. There's the bottom. I'm carefully jacking up the strut into its place so that I can get the top bolts in. With the top bolts in place, I can release the jack. And reconnect all of our connectors. And let's put in some new zip ties. The last thing we need to do on the air spring is to connect the air hose. Okay. Now RMT requires that we replace the O-ring on the end of the air hose. So we're going to replace it underneath the car. So off comes the old O-ring and the new one. On goes the new O-ring. With that, we'll put it right in place. This really wasn't that difficult to remove and install the air springs. Pretty straightforward. But we learned a lot about diagnosing the problems and making sure that the system is working again. So let's move on to rebuilding our air compressor. So let's go ahead and take it apart and let's inspect it. First, let's remove the bolts for the head. We are going to take this line off here. Off a little bit of a time trying to get this connection apart, and it's much easier than it looks like. You just got to remember, I'm going to use my wire cutters here just so I have a little thing to use to press down. What you have to do is press down this gray part, and then you pull the hose right out. It comes right out. So we're going to set that aside. And now we can see this is the inside of our cylinder. And what we're going to do is we're going to inspect the inside for any scoring. If there's any scoring or at all or any imperfections in here, then I'll go ahead and replace the head. Now, the culprit is going to be this ring on the piston right here. This is what gives the seal to the compressor so that the compressor works really well. Once it doesn't hold the seal anymore, the piston's going up and down and it's not compressing very much air at all, if any. And all it'll do is get hot. Notice that there's some corrosion on here. I'm going to clean this unit up and get ready for our kit. Okay, so now we're going to start the process of rebuilding the compressor. Now the compressor has two parts to it, if you remember. Now the main motor is in this part right here, and it's got the piston. The piston is attached to a crankshaft on the end of the motor. Goes up and down. Okay, so this part of the compressor should be just fine. We're going to put a new piston ring on the piston. Now in this section, we had noticed that there was a scoring mark on the inside of the cylinder. So I'm replacing the cylinder. I was a little bit suspicious at the beginning, and I looked in there and I saw a mark and I knew, okay, that's got to go. So we're going to replace this piece here. Now here's the Drier portion of the compressor. And in here, there's all kinds of Drier beads. So we're going to inspect those while we're in there. Let's get it apart. Let's take the cylinder head off. Be extra careful once you get the cylinder head loose. There's a big spring inside. Be careful how you take it off. Okay, off came the cylinder head. There's the spring. Inside here will be all the beads. Now let's take the dryer apart and examine the beads inside. Now I can see the beads inside of my dryer. Now these beads look okay, but I'm not sure what color they're supposed to be. However, we're going to rejuvenate them by taking the moisture out of them. Since I live in a humid environment, I think this is particularly important. And we're only going to be in here once, so let's do everything. Now we're going to rejuvenate these beads by drying them out in our oven at a low temperature. So let's take an aluminum pan and let's dump our beads out. Now, you will notice that some of them are lighter colored and some of them are darker colored. These have different saturations of moisture in them. They don't feel wet, but they are. So let's stick them in the oven and at 200 degrees Fahrenheit and get them dried out. Before drying. So while we've got the dryer beads drying in the oven, I am going to work on the compressor. So the first thing we need to do is to get the old piston ring off of the piston on the compressor. So we'll just pry this open. And off the old one comes. Now, looking through my kit of new parts, I'm going to find the new ring, which is right here. Now, I'm going to make sure everything is cleaned up in here really good. Use a little compressed air to make sure there's no dust and debris on the inside of the compressor. And with everything cleaned up, now we can start putting it together. First we'll get out our new piston ring. And we're going to put it on the same way that it came off. Now there's a little pin on the upper side of the piston. And so we have to orient the pin in the same manner of which it came off. And there we are. That looks great. So now we have the new ring on the piston. And this is probably the most important part of this little process. Now the next thing is to look at our cylinder. Now we've got a new O-ring. He's got two different kinds for different models of compressors. And if we look at mine, it just gets the plain round O-ring, which will go on there. Now, I'm not ready to put this cylinder on here because there's a valve that needs to go in here. So I'm going to have to take the valve off of the old one. Looking through my parts, let's just make sure we don't have it in the parts. Nope, I don't see it in the new parts. Okay. So we will take the old one and we're going to remove some of these parts and put them on here. Let's take our new one and let's put it back together the same way. So we've got this new cylinder head prepped and ready. Now let's look at the new bolts they gave us. These are the new bolts for the cylinder head. The manufacturer said to make sure that these holes have been cleaned out because they tend to corrode. So they send with the kit a tap. And these new bolts already have some sealant on here so they don't seize up in there. Okay, so let's go ahead and use our tap and make sure that these holes are clean. That's in here. So go in a little bit, go back a little bit, go in a little bit more, come back a little bit, and we'll just work our way in there. And there we are. We have two cleanly tapped holes. All the threads in there have been cleaned up. So let's make sure that none of this debris will get into the compressor. These are little shavings of metal, so that would be bad. So we want to get rid of those completely. Alright, now we have our new cylinder head ready to go on. It's all clean here, so we'll slip this right over the top of the piston. Then we'll put our brand new cylinder bolts in the top. So we've got our heat sensor right here, and the heat sensor is going to go back on this side. So let's get that installed. And we'll turn these bolts in. Now the cylinder head is secured. We got the new valve, spring, and the new seal in here. Now, there's something else that we need to do. This side over here is where the air comes into the compressor. And the manufacturer told me that we need to drill these 4 rivets out. And we've got 4 brand new rivets right here. And so we're going to drill these out and we're going to clean out the inside of there because any dirt that's in there is going to go into the compressor. So we need to make sure that's all clean. Now that we've drilled the rivets off, let's have a look, see what we have inside here. As I'm looking at it, I can see that ours is in very, very good condition compared to pictures that I've seen of other ones. It's all nice and clean. There's just a little bit of residue inside, so we're going to clean it out real nicely and put it back together with the new rivets. Now let's clean the faceplate side. See, there's a little bit of dirt in it. But that's looking much better. Now we'll put it back together. And we'll rivet it back together. And we have the back plate riveted back on, and the inside is all clean. Now let's go check on our dryer beads. Our beads have been dried up. They don't look much different than before, but we dried them at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 hours, so they should be fine. Now we're going to reinstall them back into our dryer container. Now we'll put the cover back on and install the little keeper fastener. So here we are, we're almost finished. Everything's been inspected and put back and just about put back together. We've got to put the dryer back on. And we'll use the new bolts that they gave us in our kit. However, there's one thing that I almost forgot, and that's to put the new spring inside. And that was in here. So let's make sure we get that spring in there. And this is the new one that's supplied with the kit. Okay, as we're putting it together, we only have one more bolt left to put in, and I am discovering something that you might want to know about. Now, I can't get my bolt in through this hole with it all assembled. So, I'm going to have to take it back apart, take the cylinder back off, put the bolt in, and then we'll put it back together. Okay, so the whole idea is we need to put these two bolts in first. We don't want the O-ring to get crushed because that's our seal. So we'll be super careful as we made it back together. And now we've got it. Let's put the air hose back on. And that's just a press fit. That's back in place. And now the unit is ready to go back in the car. The 3 bolts are in place, holding the pump back in its place, the compressor back in its place, with the bracket bolted on the front. Now it's just a matter of putting all the wires back together. And that's it. The pump is entirely installed. Let's get ready to put the inside in, the covers on, the wheels on, and let's see how she does. Whenever we rebuild or replace the compressor, we always want to make sure that we replace the relay switch. Now it's a little difficult to get at, but let's get that done. See this fuse box? Yeah, that's not where it is. Okay, so let's keep digging. Be super gentle with these trim pieces. Remove the screws holding the bottom trim in place on the dash. Now, you will also notice that this dash piece comes all the way over here underneath the steering wheel. So we're going to have to remove the trim up here in the middle of the dash, going all the way across the car in order to get it out. When you get this trim piece out, you got to be super careful when you pry not to break any of these little snappy things off. If you do, get your super glue out. And also, there is a little cover on the front of the credit card tray. Now, I wasn't so lucky on this one. Now, in theory, it's got these little nubs on the back that when you pry it gently, it'll snap off. Well, one of them broke off. It snapped off all right. So I'll just use a little bit of super glue to put that one back together when it's time to go back together. Again, be super careful with these things because they do break easily. All right, so let's move on. We've exposed the screw on the other side holding this lower portion of the dash on. So now that we've got it exposed, we'll go ahead and take it out and remove the bottom of the dash on the driver's side. And down comes the lower part of the dash. So what we have is behind this fuse box, we have another fuse. We've got a 40 amp fuse that is for the compressor. So we're going to check it real quick. And here is that 40 amp fuse. And by looking at it, luckily, the 40 amp fuse is just fine, so we can put this one back in. Now that we know that the fuse is good, we'll replace the relay. relay is the one that says 373 on it. You see the orange 40 amp fuse up at the top. And the relay is right there. It says 373 across the top, and it's gray. Now my new one that I got doesn't have any marking on it, and no big number, and it's black. So how can I determine if this is really the replacement for this? So I'm going to look at it very carefully. So let's turn them around to the plug side, and you'll notice that each plug has a number on it. And this flat one here says that it's number 87. Okay, this one is number 87. Now I look over here and look for a matching one, and it says it's number 5. So far that doesn't look good. So you will see that each relay has a wiring diagram printed right on the side of it. So I'm going to look at my new one and find its little wiring diagram. And I'm going to notice that where it says post 87 on this one, I'm going to look here and it says post 87 in parentheses, but number 5. So my number 5 here lines up with my number 87 on this side. And I will notice that the wiring diagrams look exactly the same. So by following the pins to see where they connect, I can tell that both of these units plug into the same places, have the same voltage, and so they're identical, even though they look different on the outside. So we're good. So let's put the new one in the car. Okay, so the new one goes in the car. Okay, now that's done, let's put the dashboard back together. There's the big piece. Put all the screws back in place. All the screws are back in place except for the last one, which is on the bottom on the inside. It's the only screw on the bottom. Now we'll put the trims back in. Rising. As soon as it rises enough, we'll get that jack out.
Oh, that's what you needed it to do?
Yeah. Okay. So we've successfully completed the installation of the air springs and rebuilt our pump. And as you can see, the car is pumping up just fine. It only takes a couple of seconds once you've got the system working right. Make sure that you double check your compressor pump when you're putting it together, and go ahead and bench test it before you put it in the car. It'll save you a lot of headaches down the road. Until next time, we'll see you right here on the American Garage.
Thanks for watching the American Garage. If you like this video, hit the like button and leave your comments below. And don't forget to subscribe.